The following program is an original production of WYCC PBS Chicago. Closed captioning for the professors is provided in part by the Clifford Law Offices, a personal injury and wrongful death law firm in Chicago.
A recently published book called The Charge maintains that there are 10 human drives that are necessary for improving the quality of our lives. We'll talk about how educators are using what they've learned from that book and other books to help their students in the classroom. That's on today's edition of The Professors. Joining us today to talk about The Charge and other great books are Chanel Harris-Smith, Professor of Communications at Kennedy King College, Cornell Darden, Librarian at Kennedy King College, and Dr. Nick Panamitros, Attorney and Professor at Kennedy King College. Welcome. So, The Charge, what's it about? Why are we talking about it? I know that you're really familiar with the book. Why don't you tell us a little bit about why this is something that a lot of professors at Kennedy King specifically are using in the classroom?
So you mentioned that the 10 human drives will make us happier, better people.
Sure.
So the baseline drives, which are the ones that we need to be our best selves within ourselves, are control, competence, congruence, caring, and connection.
Okay.
And then the forward drives are change, challenge, creative expression, contribution, and consciousness. And those really accentuate the ways that we should interact with others outside of ourselves and
Sure.
in the world. The first impression I got from the book was how it could help me personally to be more engaged with my students in the classroom. And then in looking at how I could use it for the students as a motivating tool was really to actually add some of these points into my syllabus. So I think my syllabus may have gotten about 3 pages longer.
Okay. Which I'm sure your students were happy about.
I'm
right?
sure.
Or not.
Or not. So I think that as a motivating tool, it looks at these points and gives us these charge points, actual actions that we can start to, undertake in our lives to make us more engaged and present every day.
You know, it's interesting because I don't use anything like this in my classes. I teach political science, social science. But this using a book like this or books like this really speak to the point of a holistic and value-centered education. I find often that education is very segmented, and we learn, reading, writing, arithmetic, that sort of thing. We learn them separately, sort of in silos. But very rarely are we taught that education is multifaceted, it's connected, it has some congruence. And we also don't look at sort of the holistic development of students when it comes to education. So in that way, I'm very interested in this conversation because it seems like The Charge really does that. It really allows us to be able to deal with those, those things that are more qualitative than they are quantitative in terms of education.
Well, I believe in the unity of knowledge. Like you said, all the disciplines somehow having some type of interconnectivity. So I believe that, there's nothing wrong with introducing a philosophical work in, say, a mathematics course or a business work and, say, an English course, if you can somehow find a connection to reach out to students and help them engage with the that syllabus.
Well, when you look at the substantive material, say you're teaching anatomy or you're teaching math, this is sort of a tool for the student to use. And, I'm looking at using it potentially in one of my classes now, and I've always lectured, whether I'm lecturing a science course or what you have you, is talk about motivation, talk about being present in the classroom or how you're feeling, esteem. And this book sort of alludes to those things, and I think that's being incorporated more and more, especially in the physical sciences, where traditionally it never was. You'd get a syllabus, it'd be chemistry or it'd be anatomy or what have you, and the student would just have to fend for themselves, chug along. And you're finding more and more professors, I think the new culture is to help them get motivated. Yeah, this stuff may be boring, it may not be of interest, explain to them why. Yep. Get them somehow so they can better absorb it and learn the material.
I want to read a small section from the book that I think encapsulates what it's talking about, and I think what we need to talk about consequently in education as a whole. In referring to the notion of our own individual destiny and our own individual personal victory, it says that it's out there. It's outside of the confines of our comforts and the pleasure of our accumulations. Beyond the architecture of our routine that we slip the bonds of our limiting beliefs, we soar magnificently above our own shortcomings and express our higher selves. It is out there in a world rich with choice and challenge and fear and freedom that your greatest gifts and adventures await you. Listen, it is out there that destiny calls. Be bold and be yourself. It is time to take charge once again. You know, that's very, very powerful. This is the kind of, I think, motivation that is an internal motivation that, and you teach college success, many students lack. I can teach them, social science, political science, et cetera, and give them the portions of my discipline that are important for them to learn. But if they don't have that intrinsic motivation, then there's a real problem. What do you deal with in a college success course that helps them to have that kind of motivation?
Well, we got to look for intuitive ways to actually motivate the students, specifically focusing on why they're there and helping them to understand that, helping them to understand dealing with stress and the things that can be a hindrance to their learning. A motivational book like The Charge would definitely do that. It'll take them outside the confines of the actual literature of the course and give them something to give them that extra push and that extra grasp to help them think of education in a more a more enlightening way.
Sure. You know, when I was in college, we read a book called The Good Society by Richard Bella. And it was a book that I read in actually a public administration course my freshman year. And it was a book that really looked at the challenges that our communities face and then looked at solutions to how we fix those challenges. And I'll never forget being a freshman at Indiana University, reading this book and being inspired that I could change the world. I've had my students read this book. It's helped me tremendously. But I'd be interested in hearing what are some of the books that you all have used in class or have inspired you personally in your own academic walk that you'd want to share with your students if you haven't already, and why those books are so important to you.
I've used The Pact,
Okay.
The Three Doctors, because they talk about their humble beginnings and the necessity of having a support system, which the Charge discusses. I've used excerpts from the autobiography of Malcolm X.
Okay.
And also Ben Carson's The Gifted Hands.
Yeah, absolutely.
I like to use texts that show, obviously narratives, because everyone can connect to a narrative.
story,
It's just
yeah.
a human, quality to be able to connect to a story. So these stories, discuss personal narratives and triumphs. The Charge talks about the importance of celebrating, small victories in your life, and how feeling as a part of a greater whole is really important. So, I think we can talk about those texts and talk about how it's important for students to be engaged and present. So Cornell, you mentioned, why they're there. So the idea that they are there is also important.
Yeah.
So, and you're here, so be here. Don't text. Be present in the classroom. Be a contributor to what we're trying to advance in the classroom today. And if persons, in these particular stories hadn't been engaged on an everyday basis, then they wouldn't have reached the success.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Did.
Yeah. How about you, Nick?
Well, before I say anything more, the book seems to have a little bit of a Buddhist or Eastern philosophy to it, and that seems to be, I think, in the last couple of years, sort of a trend, and we're seeing it get into the teaching too. I don't use any books, but I usually every day when I start my lectures, at some point, either the beginning, middle, or even at the end, I usually give them a little pep talk, and it's somewhere along these lines. I know some of my students were studying for some licensure examinations, and they're all freaking out. I'm like, you know what? At this point, what's the point? You are where you are, so conserve all that energy, and you might make that hurdle. And it's about being present. It's about patting yourself on the back. Hey, you came this far. And the fact of the matter is that 90% will pass. And second time around, almost everybody passes. Yeah. So conserve your energy. But what I usually do is give them a pep talk along these lines.
Your pep talks are so much better than mine, because mine typically deal with threatening, failing, and
negative reinforcement.
And seeing me again next semester. So I'm gonna have to take your model and be a lot more kind. Cornell.
I was raised on the other model, by the way.
Got you. What are some of the books that you use? Or you're a librarian, so goodness gracious, we could go on for probably an hour on this with you. So.
I've actually used a few books that I've found to be very effective, like Sun Tzu's The Art of War, and also one of Plato's dialogues, The Sophist. I find The Art of War using military philosophy and military strategy to help students realize that there's a way that they can conquer this thing, this college, which can be very difficult for most. Also, the Sophists, getting them involved in the idea of being a self-learner, and instead of just merely being taught, which actually helps them engage more. I know the Sophists, some can interpret it as being a little derogatory towards the actual professor, but I think throwing that salt on the professor in a way kind of helps the student becomes more powerful, empowering themselves.
You know, we've done a lot of shows on education on the professors. We've talked about education ad nauseum on a certain level. We've talked about charter schools and public schools and higher education, and you know, it's interesting because there are a few things in all those conversations that I realize are consistent themes in good schools and good educational experiences. And really, what I have found in all my work in this area is that students who are motivated and who are connected to a larger vision, larger mission, a context for their education typically do much better. And it's the problem that I have with our education system today, because we're so test-centered and so focused on these separate subjects and the testing of these subjects that we never get into those, once again, those qualitative values that people need to be successful in life, right? So books like this and the books that you all are mentioning give the students, I think, that connecting point. For me, you know, the greatest book I've ever read is the Bible. And it really made a significant difference in my life as a young man in terms of getting issues of character on straight. Well, I can tell you right now that had I not dealt with some of those character issues in my life, that I would have made some very damaging personal decisions that would have impacted my education. And so in that way, I just think it's extremely important, and we've got to look at ways that we can find to connect students in all kinds of areas around values that support education.
Well, knowing what their true values are, and then also developing a healthy perspective, I think is what this is all about. So, you know, being truly your authentic self, and then at the same time having a perspective that's healthy and helps you become successful and grow.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sometimes we have to help them find out who that authentic self is,
Yeah. Well, it's
and you know,
hard.
build that confidence within themselves. And again, the whole idea of creative expression and contribution. You know, what do you bring to the table in the classroom setting? You know, you bring a lot. You brought yourself, and that's all you can. You start with that, and then, you know, now you input, you know, an opinion. Share your story, share your experience. So, you know, that'll build that confidence and help them to find, you know, who they are, because education is supposed to do that, especially, you know, the college education. It's designed to help you find yourself.
And I think higher education, freshman students coming into it, they tend to have to throw off that yoke of a compulsory education. You know, they find this more as a chore, as something that they actually want to do. You know, they may be forced by economic reasons for seeking out education, you know, to get into the job market with their various degrees and whatnot. So getting them to engage in the idea of higher learning is a little difficult because of that compulsory education for, you know, so many years of their lives.
Well, you know, the goal of education in America has shifted from the late 1600s. 1648 was the Massachusetts Bay Colony who passed the what's called the Old Deluder Satan Act, where they thought that they should start public schools so that they could protect their kids from Satan, okay? And the Puritans started these schools under the idea of teaching the 4 R's, reading, writing, arithmetic, and religion. I tell my students that one of them obviously wasn't spelling, right? If you're spelling writing with an R. But the point is that
Arithmetic.
right, arithmetic, right? But if you look at this, so education really started with a faith-based component, and then Thomas Jefferson took this notion of education as citizenship, and that schools should be citizenship schools, and that we ought to use education to assimilate immigrants into American culture. Then we move into the early 1900s, where and that immigration focus was still there, But then now we're starting to look at more vocational ideas in education. And now, interestingly enough, the education focus now is not only vocational in the sense of getting a trade, but education really is money-centric today. And so there was a survey that was done to college freshmen in 1960 that asked what was the number one reason for going to school. They said to gain a better philosophy by which to live. That same survey was done in 1990, and the number one reason was to get paid, to make more money. So, I mean, we laugh, but it's tragic. We're up against some significant barriers in terms of teaching values and, you know, intrinsic motivation in education.
You know, your historical description of the educational system here in the United States is interesting because, you know, you talked about it started out for religious purposes. Embedded in that, you know, religious teaching is philosophy, right? So since that's been removed, more recent, you don't have that anymore. And I think that's where this needs to come in to replace or supplement, because at one point, if you're reading, you know, parables or stories from the Bible, you are getting something of this sort. You may be getting a more Western approach or whatever, but you are getting some kind of a philosophical education and how to live. So since that component's been taken out, at least in the public schools here in the United States, I think this is coming back now to fill that vacuum. Because otherwise you're just going to school, you're just getting a syllabus and that's it. Whereas if you had, you know, some kind of religious teachings, you'd be, you know, studying, you know, the story of Job. What does this mean? How do you interpret that? Blah, blah, blah. How does this affect you in your life? How are you similar to that? Et cetera, et cetera.
Well, the scenario you mentioned is extremely problematic in that if you look at many of our culture is full of these unfortunate, these tragic sort of mass killing incidents happening now. And the profile of many of these young men, because they're primarily men who were doing these mass killings, from the Aurora, Colorado situation to the one in Connecticut to the recent Boston Marathon bombings, is of young people who are very educated, who are very smart, but who are using that smartness, if you will, that education, they're using it in evil ways. And so to me, it reinforces once again, I'm not saying that if you had a values class in public schools, it would have changed these situations. What I am saying is that if we teach subject matter devoid from values, and we have a real problem. Even Dr. King himself said that one of the goals of education ought to be character. And I find it to be problematic that we're removing all of these philosophical components of education, the civic component of education, the artistic component of education, and then we wonder why, you know, we're having some of the challenges that we're having with our kids. So it seems like this is, you know, like you're saying, another way to be able to deal with that and do that, you know. And so, you know, and I'm a real advocate for it in that way, you know. So let me ask you this, what is it, and here's a good question I think for all of you all as educators and people who've obviously been through the education system, what was it that made you different from maybe your friend who did not finish school? We all have those. And what was the motivation for you to not only finish school, pursue higher education, but then make something you know, that had some sort of social benefit of your education? So, you know, we're all giving back through the education that we've received. What do you think it was for you that made you pursue that path? Anybody can answer that question. Not all at once.
That's deep. That's a deep one. Well, I can say that I've been writing since I was in the second grade, and that interest was sparked by a very wonderful language arts teacher, and you know, that was the one thing that remained consistent in my life throughout my childhood, through high school and through college. So I finally jumped on, you know, the idea that, you know, I could be a writer. When I was in college, I changed my major from psychology to English as a sophomore in college. So that was like the drive for me to find my authentic self. So I finally said, okay, this is the person who I've been for this long, so go with that. And then also kind of the quest or the drive for autonomy, which I think a lot of students, you know, this whole drive for money. You know, and going back to the book, it tells, you know, discusses how those things will not make you happy. just having money is not, alone going to satisfy you. These other things that you're going to need, you're going to have human connection. You're going to have to feel that you are a contributor. You're going to have to feel celebrated, within yourself, and to have other people say, hey, great job. So, money doesn't, just having the money doesn't do that. And so when students choose careers that, denote that that's what they're after, it's always like, oh, no, but what do you really like to do? Yeah. Students will say, well, I chose this major because I can make money. Well, but do you actually like people? Do your people skills,
You're a nurse
that?
and you chose to make money, but you don't like people,
right. Or
so.
you don't like, you're squeamish or whatever have you, so you're not going to be happy going to work every day. Yeah. So, that quest for authenticity and autonomy, being able to, express yourself freely and do the things that you want to do in your everyday life, which our everyday lives, our work is a large part of that.
That makes a lot of sense.
I agree with you with the money making, that eventually it can become old. And if you don't have the happiness coming from within, and say your happiness is based on money, the situation becomes, if you lose that money, you've lost your happiness.
Being broke can become old too. I've been on both sides of the fence, by the way. So it's nice to have a balance,
I think what motivated me, though, was actually my parents. Both of my parents were immigrants, and they really, from youngsters, really emphasized education as being a way to find the truth and find freedom. And I think the other thing specific with me is persistence. And also focusing on the goal or the dream out here, and not worrying as much about the means of getting there. Because let's face it, school for most of us is, you try to say, well, I enjoy going to school, but the fact of the matter is it has its moments, it's drudgery, and it's not fun a lot of times. But you have to look at the final product, what you'll be doing for the rest of your life. And if it means you're sticking it out for 2-3 years while you're in school, I don't think there's anything wrong with accepting that it's not going to be fun. You have to wake up early, stay up late, writing papers, blah, 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 blah. But at the end of the day, you will be, there's
a benefit there.
Yeah, absolutely. You will be this product at the end, and this will just have been a means, a very short, actually, amount of time to get there. And so if you don't, I think a lot of the students, what I notice, get hung up on getting graduating rather than actually seeing the big picture that I'll be doing this for 50 years. And this is just a little sacrifice of time right now, and I might actually enjoy it if I get a good perspective on it and focus on the bigger things that are coming later on.
And to, in your discipline, it is so vital that these students get the information that you're giving them, and that they do put their time, energy, heart into what they're doing. Because when they go into dental practice or whatever they end up doing with what you're teaching them, not only is it for them, but it's for those folks that they're they're working with, and it's huge. How about you?
I got into education similar to Nick here. I had parents who really instilled those morals and values in me to seek truth and to enjoy seeking knowledge. I happened to have had great teachers, coming up as a small child, who introduced me to things that I don't think was necessarily a part of the normal curriculum. Doing innovative things, introducing books like The Charge to me. And that really had a tremendous effect on me, and wanted me to, help spread that to others.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's interesting because what I hope comes out of even this conversation is motivation for the folks that would be watching this, whether they're in the situation where they're sort of traditional students in our situation, or people who are watching this at home who say, hey, you know what, maybe it's not too late for me to go back and do more with my own individual education. I think about the fact that for me, I have one parent that's an entrepreneur, one parent that was an educator, and I recognize very clearly in our house that that education was going to be vital no matter what I decided to do. And it was always important, and it was always stressed, and it was always pushed. But I think for me, as I said before, I've had some exposure to books, ideas, as I shared the Bible before, and these other books, that really changed what I wanted to do with my education. And I think that is the thing that when I work with my students that I want so desperately for them to get. Great, you're smart. Great, you got degrees. Great, you have some talent. Fantastic. What are you going to do with it to make the world better? What are you going to do with it so that the world is different when you leave? And I think for me, those things that happened to me spiritually and otherwise in college, are really the reason why I'm in the situation I'm in today, giving back with a degree. Even though, there are some, it's not always easy, right? But it's worth it.
Well, if you look at statistics, if people have master's degrees and doctoral degrees, how many of them actually use those degrees? You'll find that a huge percentage don't. And again, I had said persistence, or putting the rubber to the road, is key. Because just because you have a piece of paper doesn't mean things are going to automatically happen. You got to make them happen. And so I think the persistence, the drive is basically can override anything. I tell my students all the time, if you have someone that's just able to read, say, a text and understand it twice, and it may take you 6 times, if the guy that can do it in 2 doesn't do it, it's not going to happen. If it takes you 4 or 6 times longer to read it, and you do it, you're done. You did it. So you don't worry about how long it takes you, compared to somebody else. You just do it. Put the rubber to the road, get it done, and it's going to happen. And so that's where I think the difference comes about. It's that
It makes sense.
you have to stick with it.
Yeah. And working in, I am honored to work with the unique student population that we have. Community colleges used to be a place a place of last resort. That's really changed in our world today, where 50% of undergrads are actually attending community colleges. But this is all the more reason why we have to find ways to motivate our students, because many of our students are in situations where they are juggling work, and they're juggling children, and they're juggling all kinds of, challenges, and then many of them have come back to school. And so if we cannot find a way to go beyond our textbook knowledge and inspire them to educate, then I think we really missed the boat. It's very, very important for us to understand. You were going to say something. I think we cut you off.
Yeah, I was going to say the culture of the money seeking and using education as a tool to make more money is interesting. I know now we have this culture where some people think that a college education isn't really valuable. The price that it takes to attain one, how there's not a job waiting for you anymore, and you look at guys like a Mark Zuckerberg, how they can go out and make billions of dollars.
I'm gonna have to wrap you up. I apologize, but it's a very, very good point. Thank you, but we're out of time today.
Right.
So that's our show for today. But the conversation continues online at WYCC.org. We'll see you next time on The Professors.